PowerPoint on the urinary system, mostly covering chapter 30 out of the Solvable book, Practice and Principles. We're talking about the urinary system, not the excretory system, because the urinary system only has the kidneys, the ureters, bladder, and urethra. The excretory system would also include things like the skin, hair, things that have ducts that excrete. We're not going to cover any of that. We're just covering the anatomy and physiology of the kidneys, ureters, bladder, and urethra. So our objectives with this PowerPoint is to discuss the anatomical structures and physiologic process of the urinary system, describe the kidneys, nephrons, and the pathway of urine, discuss the ureters, bladder, urethra, and explain nephrotic blood flow. Here are the midterms that I want you to put into your journals. We're going to put this in the urinary, on the urinary page in your anatomy and physiology journals. Cis-O and Visic-O both mean bladder. Glomerule-O is glomerulus. Remember, the backsplash is the dividing of the combining form, and the combining form is the O in all of these words. Meato is opening or meatus. We saw that with the digestive system as well. Nephro and Reno are both kidney. Pile-O is the renal pelvis. Uro and urine-O mean urine or urinary tract. Ureter-O is for the ureter, and ureth-O is for the urethra. Common suffixes, if you wrote these in for the digestive system, you're going to see some similarities. Emia is blood condition, so we write that with a dash, and then EMIA, because it's at the end of a word, it's a suffix. Iasis is abnormal condition, something specific. Lysis is separation, destruction, or a loosening. Pathy is disease. Pexy, P-E-X-Y, is the fixation specifically of an organ. Ptosis is a prolapse, like a bladder prolapse, a downward displacement. Trypsy is crushing, such as gallstones or kidney stones. Urea for urine. Again, put those at the top of your urinary system and your anatomy and physiology journal. The next slide is also going into your journal. We have the kidneys, the ureters, bladder, and urethra. These are important fun facts of each of those areas. The kidneys has a renal cortex and a renal medulla. It produces 1 liter of urine per day. It filters 180 liters of blood per day, and it contains nephrons. The ureters are 2 slender hollow tubes, consists of smooth muscle because it uses peristalsis to move the urine down to the bladder. Extends from the renal pelvis to, that should be to, not or, to the urinary bladder. And then we have the bladder. It's an expandable sac. It stores the urine. There are differences between men and women, which we'll get into later. It has rugae. We'll get into that later as well. Smooth muscle that's running in all directions, and we'll talk about that when we talk about the bladder. Urethra transports urine from bladder to an opening in the perineum. For men, it's 15 to 20 centimeters long, and for the female, it's 4 centimeters long. This is a very quick and brief summary of each of these organs and tubes, so we're going to go into much more detail, but this gives you kind of a general idea of some of the things we'll be discussing. Here's an overall view of the urinary system. We have the kidneys. There's one on each side. If you look inside the kidney and you take a cross section of it, you have the outside layer, which is the cortex. Then the light red is the medulla. The yellow is the renal pelvis. Each of those little red nodules, or they actually look like triangles, are called pyramids. From the renal pelvis, the yellow in the center, the urine will deposit into the ureter. And then, of course, the blood supply is from the renal artery, and then the blood leaves through the renal vein. Then we have 2 ureters coming down from each kidney. It meets into the bladder, which is a smooth muscle, and then it goes into the urethra and out an opening or meatus. Put these in your journal. This is physiology. You don't necessarily need to put the whole graphic there, but just the bullet points. The urinary system regulates chemical composition of blood. It regulates blood volume and fluid balance. Regulates blood pressure. Maintains homeostasis. Regulates blood pH, and eliminates waste. You need those bullet points in your journal. The kidneys are considered one of the major organs of the body due to all of the listed functions it controls. A malfunction in the kidneys can lead to changes in the blood composition. That blood composition can result into serious pathologies and death. So again, the function of the kidneys is that of the urinary system is that it eliminates waste, regulates chemical composition of blood, regulates blood pH, regulates blood pressure, and maintains homeostasis. Hormones or enzymes are detected by receptor cells. This is how it relates to homeostasis. Hormone and enzymes are detected by receptor cells, send signal to the gland or to the brain. Neurotransmitters then send signals to glands or neuroreceptors to adapt to maintain homeostasis. The kidneys are considered to be the main homeostatic organ of the body. And you can see that little graphic there. It's talking about if there's variables in that, it triggers a chain response to then come back and regulate those chemicals or enzymes to keep the body in balance. Okay, so specifically about the kidney. So they're 2 reddish-brown organs, one on each side. They're shaped like lima beans or kidney beans, hence the name kidney, approximately the size of a bar of soap. It's located behind the peritoneum, the sac that surrounds the abdominal region to house all the organs. So behind is retro. Peritoneum, we can say, is peritoneal, regarding the peritoneum. So behind the area regarding the peritoneum, retroperitoneal. And they lay against the posterior wall of the abdominal cavity. They're surrounded by a fibrous capsule and embedded in adipose tissue. The kidneys filter 180 liters of blood per day, and it produces 1 liter of urine per day. You should recognize that from one of our earlier slides. So here we have a graph showing the 2 kidneys. We're showing veins and arteries that are leading into it, the right ureter and the left ureter. The right kidney is slightly lower than the left. Each kidney has an adrenal gland that sits superiorly, so on top of each kidney is the adrenal gland. The medial indentation is the hilus, which houses the renal artery, vein, and the beginning of the ureter. So if you look at the one that has the cross section, the medial side is concave. The outside or the lateral side is convex. Each kidney has that shape. On the concave side, so the most medial side or proximal side to the veins, you see the opening of the renal pelvis, and all the veins and arteries enter into the kidney in that spot. So that's why it's concave on the medial side. Blood comes into the kidney via the renal artery, that's the big red tube, and blood leaves the kidneys via the renal vein. Each kidney is a separate organ and functions independently. Because of that, we can live with only one kidney. If one kidney is removed, the other will increase its filtering capacity to 80% of the capacity that happened with both. The kidney is divided into two regions, the cortex, which is on the outside, and the medulla, which is on the inside. One other thing I wanted to note, the reason why the kidney on the right side of the body is slightly lower than the left is because of the anatomical structure of the kidney. Of the liver. It needs to be a little bit lower. So here's just one kidney. You can see the outside layer is called the cortex. The renal pyramids, each of those little pyramid shapes, is considered the medulla. This graphic shows well that there's minor coccyxes that are basically where the urine is draining into. There's minor coming from each pyramid, and then they converge into the major coccyx, and which goes into the renal pelvis. That's all of the yellow section. So if we took that kidney and we just took out one of those pyramids and we enlarged it, you can see that there's nephrons that are inside of that pyramid. And then the yellow there is the collecting duct that's going to go into the minor coccyx, and then to the major, and then to the renal pelvis. The renal pyramids are also called distant triangular wedges or medullary pyramids. So in readings, you'll see any of those three being described as that little triangular wedge. The tissue in between each of those wedges is called the renal column. Okay, so now we're taking, again, another picture of this. The nephron, which is, if we take that pyramid and we look closely inside of it, the nephron is the filtering unit of the kidney. It filters, reabsorbs, and excretes substance in urine. There are approximately 1.25 million nephrons in each kidney. So as we get into this, it's hard to remember that those coils are just jam-packed inside of each one of those pyramids. We're not talking about just one, we're talking about thousands within each pyramid. 85% of them are contained in the renal cortex. So if you look at the slide, that top light pink area, kind of faded pink area, is the renal cortex. What dips down into the medulla is the collecting duct. And the loop of Henle, which we will go into at much more detail. You can see from the arrows, if you can follow that, how literally convoluted that tube is, and then comes down into a collecting duct. Okay, so now we're going to take this top little section. Let me back up again. That top section that looks almost like a wrench, and then you can see where there's blood vessels going into it. That is called the renal corpuscle. So if you remember on the previous slide, the little U-shaped wrench-like structure is called the Bowman's capsule. It's a hollow cup shape. It surrounds the glomerulus, which is a system of capillaries. This is where it's a filtration membrane between it and the glomerulus, the capsule itself. So the blood flow comes into the afferent arriving afferent arteriole, comes into the glomerulus, and then the blood leaves or exits on the efferent arteriole. So again, arrive, afferent, the glomerulus, and then exiting through the efferent arteriole. The fluid that is now between the Bowman's capsule and the glomerulus is the filtrate, and it's going to head towards the proximal convoluted tubule. The glomerulus is a cluster of capillaries. So it looks like just one here, but there's a whole cluster of them. And just like other capillaries in our body, it does the filtration. It has that interchange of fluids leaving the area and then not being able to come back into the bloodstream because of the size. Here's another picture of the renal corpuscle. So I like this illustration of the balloon. If you have a balloon, you can blow it up, put your hand inside of it. That capsule is the Bowman's capsule. It's going to line around the capillaries. The filtrate seeps through that, and it sits between the glomerulus and the capsule. Later, we're going to talk about this distal tubule that's right in the center of the afferent and efferent arterioles and the macula densa. We'll talk about that at length a little bit later. But basically, if you think of it, that there's millions of these, of the nephrons. And so they have to be packed up against each other. So this literally on the left side, where it says distal tubule, is the distal tube, convoluted tube that is from another nephron. And it's exchanging nutrients that way as well. So when we get further in, we feel like sometimes it seems like we get lost in that. But just remember, as I've said before, there's thousands of these nephrons in each of those pyramids. And so they're packed up against each other. There's going to be nutrients seeping out all the time, enzymes, nutrients, and they are going to affect the nephrons that are close to them. Okay, so here's the blood supply of the kidney. You can follow it from the graph, but the sequence of blood supply is you have your renal artery. The blood then goes into the afferent arteriole, into the glomerulus, So we're at the top. We're talking about where that Bowman's capsule is. It's going into the glomerulus. And then out of the Bowman's capsule through an efferent arteriole. And then the peritubular capillaries wraps all the way around these collecting ducts, and it goes all the way down to provide nutrients, blood supply to it, but also to have an exchange of things like sodium, water, and potassium. It's finally going to make its way to the renal venule, and then to the renal vein, and then to the inferior vena cava. So I want you to write this sequence in your journals. The sequence of blood supply for the kidney: renal artery into the afferent arteriole, which goes into the glomerulus, comes out on the efferent arteriole into the peritubular capillaries, which go around the ducts, back out where it's blue through the renal venule, and then to the renal vein, and then to the inferior vena cava. So this is one nephron, the supply to one. So if you take that and you multiply it by thousands, hundreds of thousands, you'll see how much blood supply we have into our kidneys. Okay, the renal tubule. The tubule again goes from the Bowman's capsule, and then it winds across. So this is where the collected filtrate enters, and it goes through to get to the urethra. To the ureters. The tubule is hollow tube between renal corpuscle and the collecting ducts. There are three main regions of collecting ducts: the proximal convoluted tubule, so PCT, the loop of Henle, and the distal convoluted tubule, DCT. The filtrate passes through each region and empties into a series of collecting ducts. The collecting ducts are then what is attached to the renal pelvis. The proximal convoluted tubule is the region of the renal tubule that is closest to the renal capsule. The loop of Henle extends deep into the renal medulla. Then it comes back up and it goes to the distal convoluted tubule, which is the furthest away from the renal tubule. So the major functions of the renal tubule is reabsorption of important components, reabsorption of electrolytes, reabsorption of non-electrolytes, and regulating the pH level of the blood. So again, we have afferent and efferent arterioles. They go into the glomerulus, which is surrounded by the Bowman's capsule. The filtrate is excreted out. Nutrients and electrolytes are reabsorbed into the blood from this. And then there are some that continue on. The renal tubule is that section that's right next to the renal corpuscle, or the Bowman's capsule. So exactly what is happening? We have renal arteries branching into two arterioles, the afferent and the efferent. Blood enters the renal capsule via afferent arterioles and branches into capillaries where it's filtered. The filtered blood moves through the capillaries and returns to the circulation via efferent arterioles. Filtrate is filtered fluid which is moved into the renal tubule. So here we have a pretty good graphic of what is happening here. Number 1, the glomerulus filters small solutes from the blood. Number 2, the proximal convoluted tubule, that's the one that's closest to the Bowman's capsule, reabsorbs ions, water, and nutrients, and removes toxins and adjusts filtrate pH. Number 3, so that's down on the far right side, the filtrate now goes into the descending loop of Henle. Aquaporins allow water to pass from the filtrate into interstitial fluid. It loops around at the bottom of that loop and goes into the ascending loop of Henle, which reabsorbs sodium and Cl from the filtrate into the interstitial fluid. We then go into number 5, the distal tubule. It's the furthest away from the glomerulus. Selectively secretes and absorbs different ions to maintain blood pH and electrolyte balance. And then 6, it goes to the collecting duct, which remember, then goes into the renal pelvis. But at the collecting duct, it reabsorbs solutes and water from the filtrate. The right side of that just shows in a more concise way, without having all of the physiology, that whole complex. So this is if you took one of those, that whole unit of the nephron, and you stretch it out. You have afferent and efferent arterioles, and you can see some of the nutrients that are being passed through. You have water, electrolytes, glucose, amino acids, and minerals going on the proximal convoluted tubule, and then you go to the descending loop of Henle. Water is coming out, and then the ascending, you have sodium coming out until you get to the collecting duct, and now you see the entrance of potassium. You see more water coming out and urea coming out, and then it goes to the ureter. Okay, so we have the Bowman's capsule, and then we have the glomerulus. But as you can see, the afferent arteriole coming into that capsule, and then the efferent, and then that little section that's right in the middle of that's called the juxtaglomerular complex. It has 2 main cells, the juxtaglomerular cells, which controls blood pressure cells, which are blood pressure cells that secrete renin, absorbs more water to increase blood volume and to raise your blood pressure. It's functioned because it has mechanoreceptors, which are sensory cells that respond to mechanical pressure or distortion, such as touch, pressure, vibrations, and cutaneous tension. And then you have cells that are the macula densa cells. They're tightly packed chemoreceptors, which are sensory cells responding to chemicals. Chemochemical. It monitors filtrate by monitoring the level of sodium. Those are the 2 main cells, macula densa cells and juxtaglomerular cells. So this is the point where the distal collecting tube comes into contact with an afferent arteriole. So if you look at your graphic, you have one nephron and it's showing you where the little square is there. It's coming into contact with a DCT. Okay, this is the slide that has your homework assignments. So this goes into a little bit more detail, kind of a magnified section of it, and it shows the renal corpuscle. It shows all the different layers within the Bowman's capsule, the parietal layer and the visceral layer. It shows you where your basement membranes are between all of the capillaries. And then it also discusses the macula densa and the granular cells. And that whole complex is the juxtaglomerular apparatus. It's right in between the afferent and efferent cells, or veins, arterioles. So your two assignments are, the first one is the RAAS article. The link is provided there for you. I want you to read the article and then write a summary discussing the RAAS. So what that is all of the chemicals that are released right there: renin, aldosterone 2, and angiotensin. So in your own words, you're going to discuss enzymes that are involved in maintaining homeostasis, the activation of one enzyme to another. So what's the sequence? I'll give you a hint. R stands for renin. What anatomical systems or organs are involved? If renin is released, then what's the next step in this cycle? For each of those, what organs are affected? So when renin is released, how does that affect our body? What does it do? And then lastly, how does this information apply to us as massage therapists? So numbers 1 through 4 are worth 5 points each. The fifth one, discussing massage therapists, is worth 30 points. So that assignment is worth 50 points total. Then on Dig Deeper, the kidneys are an amazing organ. What fascinates you about the kidneys? So you're going to develop a model of the kidney and put it in your A&P journal on the urinary page, and then upload a picture of your model. You can use yarn, you can use pipe cleaners, you can use anything that you can think of to give yourself a physical representation of the nephron. So that's going to include your Bowman's capsule and capillaries, or the glomerulus capillary. It's going to involve the proximal tubule, the loop of Henle, and the distal tubule into a collecting duct. So that is going to be glued or taped into your journals, and then again you upload a picture. Okay, so outside of the renal cortex and the medulla, now we're going to talk a little bit more about the collecting ducts. You have the minor calcix and the major calcix. So the minor obviously are smaller, and they're coming from the pyramids, and they're going into a major. The major goes between the minor and then the renal pelvis, where the filtrate is collected. And then it goes into the ureter. You'll see the word calcix when you talk about flowers. It's the bottom. Each of those petals comes into the calcix. And for the flower, it's where the nutrients are reabsorbed back and forth for the flower to help it bloom. and then as it fades, the calcix gets shriveled up and pulls away from the petals of the flower. So it's a nutrient base. Just like our kidneys, we have that representation of the calcix, and we're pulling the urine away. So out of your Practice and Principles book, down below is the direction of blood, or the direction of filtrate. So you have the Bowman's capsule going into the renal tubule, into the collecting ducts, into the calcix, into the renal pelvis, and then down to the ureter. So this is the filtrate, which is going to become urine. Put this in your journals as well, that sequence of filtrate. Okay, the ureters are two solid, slender, hollow tubes consisting of smooth muscle. They extend from the renal pelvis to the bladder. Urine is transported by peristalsis, so that muscular contraction, just like in our digestive system, to help the urine go in the direction it needs to go. There are sphincters, so the small round muscles that contract, that are based off of pressure. They are going to stop backflow from the bladder into the kidneys. A lot of times in little kids, those sphincters are not developed enough, or they become dysfunctional for people that are elderly later in life, when they cannot control those sphincters. Urinary reflux is similar to abdominal reflux, or GERD, in that the fluid backs up and that muscle can't contain it to push the urine down, and instead the urine you void, and then the sphincter doesn't, it gives you the signal that you're done and the bladder is emptied, but then it pushes the rest of that fluid that's in the bladder, pushes it back up to some level towards the kidney. And when that happens, you have chronic kidney infections. The bladder is an expandable sac. It has rugae, which increases the surface area so that the bladder can expand. It's located in the pelvis behind the pubic symphysis. In men, it is superior, so above, to the prostate. For women, it's anterior to the vagina, but posterior to the uterus. You have a detrusor muscle, which is smooth muscle, and it helps with that expansion. The bladder can contract in all different directions because it's a smooth muscle, and the whole thing has to contract in order to void. It can contract in every direction. It can expand in every direction. So if you look at the graphic up at the top, it shows ureters and then the ureter openings inside the bladder. And some of the words were kind of cut off there, but that's the detrusor muscle that's showing you the peritoneum lifted up, and that the bladder itself is a detrusor muscle, which means it can contract in all different directions. Those little rough-edged areas of the muscle is the rugae of mucosa. Again, those are there to help smooth out the bladder as it expands and increase surface area. The bladder is controlled by the autonomic nervous system, which means it is not voluntary. The urethra is now the narrow tube below the bladder. It transports urine out of the body, and in men, it transports semen. It's longer in men because it extends through the prostate and the penis, so it makes it approximately 4 inches. For women, it sits behind the vaginal opening and the clitoris. It's between the vaginal opening and the clitoris. It's only 1.5 inches. Because of the shortness and the entrance of where the urethra comes out, women have a higher rate of bladder infections. Urination can also be called voiding and mituration. You want to write that in your journal. Urination can also be called voiding, voiding, or mituration, micturation. You'll see it either way, and I believe that question is on your quiz. And that is the end of our urinary system. We have 2 others that we will be, one other PowerPoint that I'll be putting together for a later lesson that is specifically about bodily fluids and about the blood, what happens with the blood.